The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and defeat, with undertones of the kind of exhaustion that seeped into your bones after too many battles fought by too few people. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez shifted carefully on her recovery bed, trying to find a position that didn't make her ribs feel like they were personally offended by her continued breathing. Could be worse, she muttered to herself, a habit she developed during 8 years of military service. Could be dead. The Nexus Dawn's medical facilities were a marvel of interspecies cooperation. Human diagnostic equipment, working seamlessly with Kalari bioregeneration technology, to patch up soldiers who'd been creative about finding new ways to get themselves blown up. Alina had to admit the results were impressive, even if the process felt like being repaired by enthusiastic but slightly confused aliens. Which, technically, it was. Around her, the recovery ward buzzed with the quiet activity of people trying to heal from a war that showed no signs of slowing down. The Battle of Zirian Prime had been a victory, but the kind that made you wonder if losing might have been less expensive. The Harbingers, synthetic intelligences with all the charm and empathy of a malfunctioning calculator, had been pushed back, but at a cost measured in casualty, reports that Alina tried very hard not to think about. She was contemplating whether the pain medication was making her philosophical, or if war just naturally led to that kind of thinking, when she noticed her ward mate for the first time. Really noticed, not just the peripheral awareness of another body in the next bed that military training taught you to maintain even while unconscious. The woman was tall, even lying down, with the elongated ears and luminous skin that marked her as Kalari. Her injuries looked serious, plasma burns across both arms and what appeared to be shrapnel damage along her torso. But she carried herself with a composure that suggested pain was merely an inconvenience to be endured rather than a problem to be solved. What caught Alina's attention wasn't the injuries, though. It was the way every medical technician, nurse, and visiting officer who entered their section of the ward seemed to straighten unconsciously when they saw her. Not fear exactly, but the kind of automatic respect that usually indicated either exceptional competence or exceptional authority. "The burns are healing well," the woman said quietly to a young Kalari soldier in the bed across from them, her voice carrying the musical quality that made even casual conversation sound like poetry. "The regeneration matrix shows excellent integration. You'll be back to full mobility within the week." Alina blinked. The woman was reading medical charts, not her own, but other patients', with the kind of casual expertise that suggested either extensive medical training or access to information that regular patients shouldn't have. How bad was the fighting in Sector 7? Alina asked, partly out of curiosity and partly because 3 days of enforced bed rest had left her desperate for conversation that didn't involve medical personnel asking about her bowel movements. The woman turned to face her, and Alina found herself looking into eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't measure. "Bad enough," she replied. "Your unit fought well. The 3rd Marine Division, correct? You held the northern approach when the Harbinger assault drones broke through our initial defensive line." Alina sat up carefully, ignoring the protest from her ribs. "You know about that. Were you attached to command staff?" "Something like that." The woman's expression carried a hint of amusement that Alina couldn't quite interpret. "You showed remarkable tactical flexibility when your original position became untenable. The fighting withdrawal you coordinated probably saved 200 lives. You were watching our sector that closely." Alina studied her ward mate's face, noting details she'd missed before. The way her luminous skin seemed to pulse faintly with bioelectrical activity. The precise way she spoke that suggested someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. The fact that her injuries were exactly the kind you'd expect from someone who'd been fighting at the very front of the assault. "I was there," the woman said simply, "fighting alongside your Marines when the Harbingers deployed their new plasma artillery. You adapted your tactics in real time to account for weapons systems none of us had encountered before." Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the medical bay's temperature control. You were in the ground assault, frontline infantry, among other things. But you read medical charts like you're a doctor, and everyone who comes through here treats you like you're someone important. Alina's tactical mind was putting together pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. What exactly is your role in this war? The woman was quiet for a moment, studying Alina with an intensity that made her feel like she was being evaluated for something she didn't understand. What's your name, Sergeant? Vasquez. Alina Vasquez, 3rd Marines, 2nd Battalion. Alina Vasquez, the woman repeated, as if testing how the name felt. You asked what my role is. May I ask you a question in return? Alina nodded, though part of her suspected she was about to step into conversational territory that would be difficult to navigate. In your experience, Alina Vasquez, what makes someone a good soldier? The question was so unexpected that Alina found herself answering before she'd considered whether it might be some kind of test. Competence under pressure, ability to work as part of a team, willingness to put the mission and your people ahead of personal safety. She paused, thinking about the battles she'd fought and the people she'd served with, and understanding that sometimes the right thing to do and the smart thing to do are different things, and choosing right anyway. Even when choosing right means accepting personal risk or sacrifice. Especially then, anyone can follow orders when it's easy. Soldiers prove themselves when it's hard. The woman smiled then, not the polite expression Alina had seen her use with medical staff, but something genuine and warm that transformed her entire face. Alina Vasquez, I think you understand soldiering better than most people who have worn the uniform their entire lives. Alina felt herself responding to that smile despite not understanding what had prompted it. Thank you, though I notice you still haven't answered my question about your role in this war. Actually, I did. You just haven't realized it yet. The woman's expression grew more serious, though the warmth remained. You see, Alina, everything you said about what makes a good soldier, the competence, the teamwork, the willingness to sacrifice for others, those same qualities are essential for other roles as well. Such as being responsible for the lives and welfare of millions of people who depend on your decisions. Such as making choices that will determine whether entire worlds live or die. Such as standing in the front lines not because you have to, but because your people need to see that you're willing to share the risks you ask them to take. Alina stared at her wardmate, pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place with uncomfortable clarity. You're not just a soldier, are you? No, Alina Vasquez, the woman said quietly. I am not just a soldier. Then what are you? The woman's smile returned, carrying depths of meaning that Alina was only beginning to understand. Greater than that. Before Alina could process what greater than that meant, the medical bay's emergency lighting activated with the kind of urgent pulsing that made every soldier's spine straighten automatically. The ship's intercom crackled to life with a voice that carried barely controlled panic. All hands, battle stations. Harbinger attack craft detected on approach vectors. This is not a drill. Medical personnel, prepare for incoming casualties. Alina was already reaching for her weapon, before remembering that patients in medical recovery weren't typically issued sidearms. Around the ward, those patients who could move were helping those who couldn't reach emergency positions, but Alina's attention was entirely focused on her ward mate's reaction to the crisis. The woman who had moments ago been having a philosophical discussion about the nature of soldiering was now moving with purpose that transformed the entire atmosphere of the medical bay. She stood smoothly, despite injuries that should have left her immobile, and approached the nearest communication terminal with the kind of casual authority that made Alina's tactical instincts scream warnings about chain of command protocols she didn't understand. Command, this is Lyrelay. Status report on the incoming attack formation. Alina's blood went cold. There was only one Lyrelay in the combined fleet, whose voice would be instantly recognized by the ship's bridge crew, and she was approximately 40 light-years away in the secure command center at "Your Majesty," came the immediate response over the comm. 18 Harbinger assault craft, approaching from Vector 77 Mark 12. They appear to be targeting the medical convoy specifically. "Your Majesty." Alina stared at the woman she'd been casually chatting with for 3 days, watching as Queen Lyrale of the Kalari Empire began coordinating the defense of the medical fleet. While wearing a hospital gown that barely covered the plasma burns she'd sustained fighting in the front lines like a common soldier. "Redirect Hunter Squadron from Patrol Route Alpha to intercept," Queen Lyrale said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made admirals scramble to follow orders. "And signal the escort carriers to launch all available fighters. The Harbingers have learned to target our medical facilities. They're trying to break morale by attacking wounded soldiers who can't fight back." "Understood, Your Majesty." Implementing Defensive Formation Delta. Queen Lyrale. Alina's mind was still struggling to adjust to the reality of who she'd been talking to, turned back toward the ward, as if coordinating fleet-level combat operations, while injured was perfectly routine. "Alina," she said, using the same tone she'd used for their earlier conversation, "you should help get the non-mobile patients to the emergency shelters. This attack is going to be more coordinated than anything we've seen from the Harbingers before." "Your Queen Lyrale," Alina said, because her brain apparently felt the need to state the obvious while processing the impossible. "I am," the Queen replied, already moving to help a wounded Kalari soldier toward the emergency exits. "Though I should mention that in a medical bay under attack, royal titles are considerably less useful than medical training and tactical experience. Are you mobile enough to help with patient evacuation?" Alina found herself moving automatically, years of military training overriding her shock at discovering she'd been sharing war stories with the supreme commander of an entire civilization. "Your Majesty, what are you doing here?" "In the medical bay, I mean. Shouldn't you be in a command center somewhere, surrounded by advisors and security details?" Queen Lyrale paused in her efforts to help a human marine who'd lost both legs to Harbinger plasma fire. "Alina, you asked me earlier what makes a good soldier. May I ask you what makes a good leader?" Alina considered the question, while helping move patients toward the reinforced emergency compartments. Around them, the ship's defensive weapons were beginning to engage the Harbinger attack craft. The vibration of weapons fire transmitted through the hull, adding urgency to their evacuation efforts. "Someone who takes responsibility for their people's welfare," Alina said. "Someone who makes the hard decisions and lives with the consequences. Someone who—" She stopped, understanding beginning to dawn. "Someone who shares the risks they ask others to take." "Exactly. Alina Vasquez, I am the Queen of the Kalari Empire. That means I am responsible for the lives and welfare of 14 billion people across 43 worlds. When I ask soldiers to fight and die for our civilization's survival, I believe I should be willing to do the same." The ship shuddered as Harbinger weapons found their mark, but Queen Lyrale's hands remained steady as she worked to secure medical equipment that couldn't be evacuated. Alina watched her work, finally understanding what she'd meant by greater than that. "You're not greater than a soldier because you're above us," Alina realized. "You're greater than a soldier because you're a soldier and everything else, Queen, Commander, Symbol, all at the same time." Queen Lyrale looked up from the medical scanner she was securing, and her smile carried warmth that no amount of royal protocol could manufacture. "Now you're beginning to understand why I was on Zirian Prime fighting alongside your Marines, instead of observing the battle from orbit." The emergency lighting shifted to combat status as the Harbinger attack intensified. Through the medical bay's reinforced windows, Alina could see the flashes of weapons fire as human and Kalari fighter craft engaged the attacking synthetic ships in desperate combat above the medical convoy. "Your Majesty," Alina said, then caught herself. Lyrale, the attack on Zirian Prime, you weren't there as an observer or ceremonial presence. You were there as a combat soldier. I was there because that's where my people needed me to be. Not giving orders from a safe distance, but fighting beside them, sharing the same risks, facing the same fears. Queen Lyrale moved to a communication terminal, her fingers dancing across controls that reconfigured the ship's defensive systems with the expertise of someone who understood both the technology and the tactical situation. Alina, do you know why the Harbingers specifically target medical facilities? Psychological warfare. Attack the wounded and demoralize to break the will of active combat units. Precisely. Which means that defending medical ships isn't just about preserving lives. It's about preserving hope. Every soldier who sees us protect our wounded is a soldier who believes their sacrifice matters, that they won't be abandoned if they fall in battle. The ship's weapons fire intensified, but Alina barely noticed. She was watching Queen Lyrale coordinate fleet-level defensive operations while simultaneously helping wounded soldiers reach safety, and beginning to understand that true leadership wasn't about commanding from a distance. It was about being present where your presence mattered most. The attack is breaking off, Queen Lyrale reported, reading data streams from multiple sources simultaneously. Hunter Squadron eliminated 6 Harbinger craft, and the escort carriers drove off the remainder. No medical ships lost, minimal casualties. Alina stared at the woman who had just saved hundreds of lives through tactical decisions made while wearing a hospital gown and carrying plasma burns from her own combat injuries. You coordinated that entire defense while you should have been in bed recovering from frontline combat. Queen Lyrale settled back onto her medical bed with obvious relief, her expression carrying the kind of satisfaction that came from a job well done. Alina Vasquez, you asked if I was a soldier. The answer is yes, I am a soldier. But I am also a queen, a tactical commander, a symbol of hope for my people, and someone who believes that the best way to serve those you lead is to stand beside them when they need you most. Alina looked at this remarkable woman who had just redefined her understanding of leadership, courage, and duty. Greater than that, she repeated quietly. Not greater than a soldier, Alina. Greater than just a soldier. The distinction matters. The journey to Kepler Station took 6 days, during which Alina discovered that recovery time with an alien queen was significantly more educational than her previous medical leaves. Queen Lyrale, who insisted Alina continue using her first name despite the revelation of royal status, seemed genuinely interested in Alina's perspective on everything from small unit tactics to the psychological challenges of leading people into situations where death was a statistical probability rather than a remote possibility. Tell me about the worst command decision you've ever had to make, Queen Lyrale said during one of their conversations, her tone carrying the kind of clinical interest that suggested she was comparing notes rather than making polite conversation. Alina considered the question while watching Kalari medical technicians work their bioregenerative magic on her ribs. 3 days of treatment that would have taken weeks using human medical technology alone, and she was already approaching full mobility. Hadrian's world, Alina said finally. My squad was providing covering fire for civilian evacuations when Harbinger forces broke through our defensive perimeter. I had 8 Marines and about 40 seconds to decide whether to maintain our position and probably die, or fall back to secondary positions and leave 300 civilians exposed to direct attack. What did you choose? I split the squad. Sent 4 Marines to establish overwatch positions that could provide some covering fire for the civilians, kept 4 with me to conduct a fighting withdrawal that would draw Harbinger attention away from the evacuation zone. Queen Lyrale studied Alina's expression with the kind of attention that suggested she understood the weight of tactical decisions measured in lives. How many people did you lose? 2 Marines from the Overwatch team. Corporal Martinez and Private Singh. They held their position until the last civilian transport cleared the landing zone, then got overrun by Harbinger assault units. Alina's voice carried the kind of controlled emotion that came from discussing losses that never stopped hurting. But we saved 297 civilians and 6 Marines. By the numbers, it was the right call. But Alina looked at Queen Lyrale, seeing understanding in her luminous eyes that went beyond tactical analysis. But Martinez had a daughter, and Singh was 3 weeks away from rotating home to get married. The numbers don't account for the fact that good people died, because I made choices about their lives without asking their permission. Alina, Queen Lyrale said quietly, would your Marines have chosen differently if you'd asked them? The question hit Alina like a tactical surprise she should have seen coming. No, she admitted. They would have volunteered to hold the overwatch positions. Martinez and Singh both. They would have insisted on taking the most dangerous assignment if they'd known it would save more lives. Then you didn't make the choice for them. You made the choice they would have made for themselves, but faster and with better tactical information than they had access to. That's what command responsibility means, making the decisions your people would make if they had all the information you have. Alina stared at this alien queen, who seemed to understand the burden of command in ways that Alina's human superior officers rarely did. Is that how you justify sending people into battles they might not survive? Queen Lyrale was quiet for a long moment, her expression growing distant in a way that suggested she was remembering decisions she wished she'd never had to make. No, she said finally, I don't justify those decisions. I accept responsibility for them, learn from them, and try to make sure that every life lost serves a purpose worthy of the sacrifice. That's a heavy burden to carry. It is, but it's lighter when shared with people who understand the weight of it. Alina found herself studying Queen Lyrale's face, noting the subtle signs of stress and exhaustion that royal composure couldn't entirely conceal. How do you do it? Command an entire empire at war, fight on the front lines, and still maintain the kind of optimism that makes people believe things are going to work out. Who says I maintain optimism? Queen Lyrale's smile carried a hint of self-deprecating humor. Alina, most days I wake up terrified that I'll make a decision that gets millions of people killed. The difference between despair and leadership isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite the fear, because people need you too. And the frontline combat. You could command this war from safety, surrounded by advisors and strategic displays. Why risk yourself in ground assaults that other people could handle? Queen Lyrale turned to face Alina directly, her expression growing serious. Because the moment I ask soldiers to face risks I'm not willing to share, I stop being a leader and become just another politician sending other people's children to die for abstract principles. Alina felt something shift in her understanding, not just of Queen Lyrale but of leadership itself. You fight on the front lines to maintain moral authority over your own command decisions. I fight on the front lines because that's where soldiers need to see their leaders, not safely directing operations from orbit, but standing beside them, facing the same dangers, sharing the same fears. Queen Lyrale's voice carried the kind of conviction that made Alina understand why entire civilizations would follow her into impossible battles. When a Marine sees their queen bleeding alongside them, they know that every order they follow comes from someone who understands the cost of that order personally. That's why everyone in the medical bay treats you with such respect, Alina realized. It's not just your royal title, it's the knowledge that you've earned the right to make decisions about their lives because you're willing to risk your own. Respect that must be earned through action rather than inherited through bloodline, Queen Lyrale agreed. Alina, you asked me what I was, and I said greater than that. What I meant was that being queen means being everything a good soldier is, competent, brave, willing to sacrifice for others, but also accepting responsibility for decisions that affect millions of lives rather than just your immediate unit. Elena nodded slowly, finally understanding the distinction. A soldier protects their people. A queen protects all her people, even the ones she's never met, even the ones who don't know her name. Even the ones who disagree with her decisions, even the ones who question her authority, even the ones who would prefer someone else wear the crown. Queen Lyrale's expression carried the weight of absolute responsibility accepted without reservation. That's what makes it greater than soldiering, Elena. Not superior to it, but encompassing it and extending beyond it to include responsibilities that no single person should have to bear alone. Elena studied this remarkable woman who had just redefined her understanding of what leadership could be. Is that why you're here, recovering in a medical bay instead of a royal facility? Because being here, with wounded soldiers, is part of carrying those responsibilities. Queen Lyrale smiled, and for the first time since Elena had learned her identity, the expression was entirely without the weight of royal duty. Actually, Elena Vasquez, I'm here because the conversation has been exceptional, the company has been honest, and for a few days I've been able to remember what it feels like to be just a soldier talking to another soldier about the things that matter. Elena found herself returning that smile, understanding finally that she hadn't been talking to alien royalty for the past 6 days. She'd been talking to a fellow warrior who happened to wear a crown, and who had chosen to trust her with insights into the loneliness and responsibility of command that few people would ever see. Thank you, Elena said quietly. For what? For letting me see what greater than that really means. Kepler Station was humanity's crown jewel in the outer territories, a massive orbital platform that served as both military stronghold and civilian refuge for the millions of people displaced by the Harbinger War. Elena had visited it twice before, but never while traveling in the company of alien royalty, who insisted on reviewing casualty reports during the docking approach. The attack on the Centauri colonies was worse than we initially thought, Queen Lyrale said, studying data streams on her personal display. 800,000 confirmed casualties, with another 2 million missing and presumed dead. Elena watched her process information that would have broken most people's ability to function. How do you look at numbers like that and still get up in the morning? By remembering that the alternative to fighting is watching the Harbingers exterminate every sentient species in the galaxy, Queen Lyrale replied, her voice carrying the kind of controlled determination that Elena was beginning to recognize as her default response to overwhelming tragedy. And by focusing on the fact that for every person we lose, we save 10 others who would have died without our intervention. The docking bay was a symphony of controlled chaos, supply ships being unloaded, wounded personnel being transferred to medical facilities, and the constant flow of military and civilian traffic that kept a wartime station functioning. Elena had expected some kind of formal reception for Queen Lyrale, but instead found herself following the Queen through standard debarkation procedures like any other passenger. Your Majesty, Elena said as they joined the queue for security processing, shouldn't there be some kind of protocol for your arrival? Official escorts, security details, that sort of thing. Queen Lyrale's expression carried a hint of amusement. Elena, I spent the last week in a medical bay wearing a hospital gown and discussing tactical philosophy with a human Marine sergeant. If I were concerned about maintaining royal dignity, I would have chosen different accommodations. They had barely cleared station security when the emergency alert system, activated with the kind of urgent tone that made every military person within hearing distance stop what they were doing and listen for details. Elena's blood went cold as the announcement crackled through the station's communication system. All personnel, condition red, massive Harbinger assault fleet detected at jump point 7, estimated arrival time 4 hours. This is not a drill. All civilian evacuation protocols are now in effect. Around them, Kepler Station transformed from a busy hub of activity into a military installation preparing for siege. Alina watched personnel move with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from drilling for exactly this scenario. But she also saw the underlying tension that came from knowing this wasn't another exercise. 4 hours, Queen Lyreley said, her tactical mind already working the problem. Not enough time for a full civilian evacuation, but sufficient for implementing layered defensive strategies if we coordinate properly with the human command structure. Alina stared at her. You're not thinking of participating in the defense planning, are you? You're still recovering from frontline combat injuries. Queen Lyreley was already moving toward the station's command center, with the kind of purposeful stride that made Alina realize the question had been rhetorical. Alina, this station represents the last major stronghold in this sector. If it falls, the Harbingers will have a clear path to 12 human colony worlds and 8 Kalari settlements. This isn't a battle I can observe from a safe distance. Alina found herself following Queen Lyreley through corridors that were rapidly filling with personnel, responding to battle stations' alerts. Your Majesty, with all due respect, you're one person. Even if you're a tactical genius, there are limits to what you can contribute to a defensive operation this scale. Queen Lyreley paused outside the entrance to the station's primary command center. Turning to face Alina with an expression that carried depths of meaning, Alina was still learning to read. Alina Vasquez, what did you think when you first realized who I was? Alina considered the question, remembering her shock at discovering she'd been casually chatting with alien royalty. Honestly, I was intimidated. Royal titles, command of an entire civilization, responsibility for billions of lives. It seemed impossible for any one person to handle all of that. And now, Alina thought about the past week, watching Queen Lyreley coordinate fleet defenses while wearing a hospital gown, listening to her discuss the weight of command decisions that affected millions of lives, seeing her approach leadership as an extension of soldiering rather than something separate from it. Now I think that being queen doesn't make you different from the soldiers you lead, Alina said slowly. It just means you're a soldier whose unit happens to include entire civilizations. Queen Lyreley smiled then, the genuine expression that Alina had come to treasure during their conversations. Alina, that understanding is exactly why I want you beside me during this battle. Me, Your Majesty, I'm a staff sergeant. I don't have clearance for strategic command operations. You have something more valuable than security clearance, Queen Lyreley continued. You understand warfare from the perspective of the people who actually fight it. Strategic planning is useless if it doesn't account for what happens when plans meet reality at the squad level. Alina found herself being escorted into the station's command center, a vast chamber filled with holographic displays showing real-time tactical data from across the sector. Human admirals and Kalari fleet commanders were coordinating defensive positions with the kind of controlled urgency that came from knowing failure meant the death of millions. Your Majesty, Admiral Chen said, approaching with the kind of relief that suggested Queen Lyreley's presence had been specifically requested. Thank God you're here. The Harbinger fleet is larger than anything we've encountered, over 200 capital ships, supported by thousands of synthetic attack craft. Queen Lyreley studied the tactical displays with the focused attention Alina had seen her apply to casualty reports and medical charts. What's our defensive capability? 43 capital ships, mixed human and Kalari, station defensive batteries, fighter squadrons from 6 carriers, and approximately 12,000 ground troops if they attempt a boarding action. Alina did the math automatically, her stomach clenching at the implications. They outnumber us 5-1 in capital ships, and their synthetic fighters don't require life support or fear management. Queen Lyreley glanced at Alina with approval. Exactly. Admiral Chen, conventional defensive strategies won't work against these odds. We need to approach this battle differently. What do you recommend, Your Majesty? Elena watched Queen Lyreley transform from the thoughtful woman she'd been talking with for a week into the tactical commander, who had orchestrated victories across multiple star systems. But what impressed her most was that the transformation wasn't a change of personality. It was simply the same person applying her capabilities to a larger-scale problem. We turned their numerical advantage into a tactical disadvantage, Queen Lyreley said, manipulating the holographic displays to show new fleet formations. The Harbingers rely on overwhelming force and synthetic coordination. They expect us to meet them in conventional battle formation, where their numbers will tell. And instead, we fragment their fleet and force them to fight multiple smaller engagements, where superior tactics can overcome numerical disadvantage. Queen Lyreley's plan began taking shape on the tactical displays, showing human and Kalari ships positioned in a complex pattern that would draw the Harbinger forces into a series of ambush zones. Elena studied the formation, recognizing the principles from ground combat operations she'd participated in. You're treating the entire star system like urban warfare terrain, using asteroids, space stations, and debris fields the way infantry uses buildings and cover. Precisely. Elena, this is where your perspective becomes valuable. How would you attack a defensive position like this if you were commanding ground troops? Elena found herself analyzing fleet-level strategy, using principles she'd learned leading 8-person Marine squads, and discovering that tactics scaled up more effectively than she'd ever imagined. I try to identify and eliminate the command structure first, take out whoever's coordinating the defense, then overwhelm the remaining units before they could adapt to new leadership. Which means they're going to target you specifically, Your Majesty. The moment the Harbingers identify your command signature, they'll commit whatever resources necessary to eliminate you. Queen Lyreley nodded, clearly having reached the same conclusion. Admiral Chen, I want my personal command ship positioned at the forward edge of the defensive formation. Elena, you'll serve as my tactical liaison. Your job is to tell me when our strategies are creating problems for the people actually doing the fighting. Elena stared at her. Your Majesty, you're deliberately making yourself a target to protect the rest of the fleet. I'm positioning myself where I can do the most good, Queen Lyreley corrected. Elena, you asked me what makes someone greater than a soldier. This is part of it, accepting that sometimes the most important thing you can do is draw enemy fire away from people who can't protect themselves as effectively. The battle that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. Fighting alongside Queen Lyreley in the command center of her personal warship, she discovered that strategic warfare was remarkably similar to small unit tactics, just with higher stakes and more complicated logistics. Queen Lyreley's tactical brilliance was evident, but what impressed Elena more was the way she maintained awareness of how her decisions affected individual units throughout the fleet. 3rd Squadron is taking heavy casualties in Sector 7, Elena reported, monitoring communication channels from across the battle space. Redirect them to fallback position Delta, Queen Lyreley ordered, and signal the Kalari heavy cruisers to provide covering fire for their withdrawal. Elena watched the Queen balance strategic objectives against the lives of individual soldiers, with the same care she'd seen her apply to treating wounded personnel in the medical bay. This was leadership at its highest level, accepting responsibility for outcomes that would determine the survival of civilizations, while never forgetting that every decision affected real people with names, families, and dreams. When a Harbinger assault team finally breached their ship's hull in a desperate attempt to eliminate Queen Lyreley, Elena found herself fighting alongside alien royalty in the corridors of a battle-damaged warship, using skills she'd learned as a grunt to protect someone whose death would doom millions of people. Elena, Queen Lyreley said as they took defensive positions behind makeshift barricades, her plasma rifle handling the attacking synthetics with the same competence she'd shown coordinating fleet operations. Do you understand now what I meant by greater than that? Elena, providing covering fire while the Queen coordinated continued fleet operations via her command interface, finally had her answer. You're not greater than a soldier because you're above the fighting. You're greater than a soldier because you can be a soldier, a queen, a tactical genius, and a symbol of hope all at the same time, and somehow make it look like those are all just different aspects of the same job. Queen Lyrale smiled, even while engaging hostile synthetics in close combat. Elena Vasquez, when this battle is over,